We're at the moment at a crossroads where we're having a great debate about the future of cryptocurrency, about the future of finance. And a lot of people are expressing some very strong opinions, myself included. The backdrop to all of this is all of the people who aren't in this room, who will never be in a room like this. In 2013, I visited for the first time the beautiful country of Argentina, and I did a talk in Buenos Aires, and it completely changed the direction and trajectory of my involvement in Bitcoin and open blockchains. For the first time, I didn't need to explain why. Why Bitcoin? Why open blockchains? Why freedom of finance? Everybody there was interested in one and only one question: how? How do I do it right now? Because the why is obvious. It's obvious to people from Argentina. Someone came to me at the conference and said, "You've inspired me today. I was terrified to come to this conference. I was afraid of what might happen if our government changes again." My grandparents were kidnapped by the previous regime. We didn't see them for months. We thought they'd thrown them out of an airplane. Think about that for a second. We talk about financial inclusion, we talk about the banked and the unbanked, and we have no clue in our position of privilege what this means. It shook me to the core. And I've had conversations like that every year since I've started working in this space. People who come to me and say, "I hear you," because that's my story too. What does it mean to be unbanked? The World Bank defines unbanked as the 2.5 billion people who have absolutely no access to financial services and live in cash-based societies. Conveniently, they only count heads of household, meaning the spouses and children are unimportant in this calculation. Only the primary earners matter. And yet we know that in the vast majority of the world, finance is controlled by women. They're not counted as the head of household. To be unbanked is not to simply have only access to a cash-based society. To be unbanked is to lack connectivity to the world. It's to lack the ability to participate in trade and commerce, to be able to get a job that connects you with other people who want your services around the world, to build a future for your children. It is to be condemned to poverty. And when we look at that, what do we think? They don't have money, that's why they're unbanked. Wrong. Absolutely wrong. They don't have access. They don't have documentation. They don't have the necessary literacy to fill in an application form. And sometimes they don't have the clothes or the shoes or the appearance to even be able to enter a bank without getting kicked out by the security guard. That's what it means to be unbanked. And what does that do? It creates enormous poverty around the world, just so we can persist in this petty bourgeois idea that as long as we have every participant in every transaction prove their identity, and we can track and control every transaction through this totalitarian surveillance system, we will end crime. And in order to believe in that false idea of safety through totalitarian control, we condemn billions of people to poverty. Billions of people, not 2.5 billion. Many, many more. We talk about financial inclusion from the perspective of the rich and privileged world we live in, the world I live in. As an American citizen, I have access not only to open a bank account, but also to trade in multiple currencies without restrictions, access to unlimited investment opportunities all around the world, access to capital, liquidity, and credit, the stability of a currency that doesn't destroy itself overnight, taking my entire savings with it, and hopefully most of the time, access to institutions that are not actively stealing my money, or governments that are not actively destroying the currency in order to pay off their debt through shadow inflation, hyperinflation, and then finally financial collapse. How many people have that? Everyone in this room, probably. But if you count all of the people around the world who have access to that kind of financial service, it's maybe 1.5 billion. And that's why, after 2013, I started saying strongly and loudly, this is about the other 6 billion. That's what financial inclusion means. Our regulatory system is actively excluding people from access to finance. We have finally reached a point where access to the most basic financial services has become a privilege that the average person has to exercise this dance of proving themselves worthy in front of a banker, of filling in reams of paperwork and application forms in order to be granted the privilege of financial services. And we even turn around and condemn cash, the ultimate peer-to-peer, anonymous, fungible mechanism that for millennia has provided financial services to everyone, basic financial services. And cash has one fatal flaw, and it's not that it's anonymous, that it's its greatest feature. And it's not that it's used by criminals. Criminals get a banking license and defraud people by the millions. Its greatest feature is that it is available to everyone without vetting. Its greatest feature is that it is an open, transparent, neutral, verifiable, peer-to-peer transactional system. And its greatest weakness is that it is constrained by geography and locality. It doesn't have range and scale. And now we have a new form of digital cash, which is also open, and it's also neutral and verifiable, unforgeable, transportable. But this one is borderless. It's censorship resistant. It can be used even when your government doesn't want you to use it. It can be used without privilege, without identity. And it can be used everywhere in the world by whoever wants to use it, by simply downloading the software and running it on whatever computing device they can afford. That is the real revolution here. And while we're having a little privileged discussions about, should we regulate crypto? How much should we regulate crypto? Who should regulate crypto? Fuck that. Crypto is about providing universal basic finance to whoever needs it, everywhere in the world, whether we like it or not. And what will people do with universal basic finance? What they've done for millennia with access to cash. They will build a future for their children. We are paralyzed by the fear of a few bad actors, blinded by the fact that the worst actors are the ones who act with state privilege and endorsement, with the intelligence agencies hand in hand, inside the surveillance capitalism mechanism to fund dictators and drug lords all around the world with our tax money to the tune of trillions. The real terrorism, the real drug financing doesn't happen in cash. It happens in millions of barrels of oil and billions of pallets of dollars transmitted through wire transfers by the banks who get caught again and again and again and again. And they pay a fine that is a fraction, not only of the criminal behavior that they've profited from, but of the tens of thousands of deaths they've directly contributed to, and not a single person goes to jail. And at the same time, some people have the audacity to say that we need to end cash in order to stop crime. How magnificently self-righteous. In the United States, 18% of the population does not have access to banking services. That's 60 million people. I recited this fact at a banking conference, and one lady in the back raised her hand and said, "Why should we give illegals bank accounts?" That's a chilling statement to make. Let me translate it to you in words that will make more of an impact. Those people don't deserve the privilege of financial inclusion. Those people. When your neighbor says, "Those people don't belong in our neighborhood," it freaks you out because you suddenly realize you're living next to a bigot. But when a banking regulator says, "Why should we give illegals a bank account?" I calmly responded, "You shouldn't. We will." At the last conference I attended, after I gave a speech decrying the lack of security and financial inclusion, a young man came to me and said, this really spoke to my personal story. Young man in his 20s has been living in Western and developed countries for the past 15 years, has not been able to open a bank account in 15 years. Every time I write my name and place of birth in the application, the process is already ended. I was born in Iran. I didn't choose that. I didn't do anything. I pay my taxes. I have a job. All I want is to deposit my paycheck in a bank account so I can buy groceries. For 15 years, I've been unable to do that. That is the face of the unbanked. There are people walking the streets around you in this city of privilege, in the independent district of the City of London, bought and paid for by banking corporations, in this little enclave that is the Vatican of capitalism, a city within a city. People walking around you, invisible people, your janitors, your service professionals, the people making you a sandwich who don't have a bank account, who take their paycheck in cash and they go to various places in order to ask for payday loans. Maybe they take a check or other form of payment they can't deposit, and they get charged 10 or 15% or 30% to send money home to their loved ones so they can support a basic life of subsistence. That's the unbanked. They're right here in this city. Don't imagine the great masses of Africa. Of course, they're unbanked. Or Southeast Asia, or South America, right here, your neighbors. And they have been made to live in that position just so we can continue this illusion that safety comes from totalitarian surveillance. This very conference is being sponsored by a company that is spreading around millions of dollars in marketing that does surveillance, that is actually promoting and advancing the state of the art. You all have their name on your badge. Look down and check it out. A company that builds state-of-the-art surveillance and then shares and sells that data to companies that further progress that data to intelligence agencies. And this lovely form of trickle-down surveillance eventually reaches some regime that likes to cut up journalists with hacksaws. Don't fool yourself. There is no ability to separate your position within a company like that from the moral implications of your actions. And I say to you, If you're hiring people and you see names like that on the resume, just like if I was hiring people and I saw General Dynamics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, or any of the companies in our space that are promoting and actively pursuing surveillance technology to sell it to the highest bidder, they have declared moral bankruptcy. If you declare moral bankruptcy, you should have 7 years of trying to find a job and being interrogated about your ethics. Just like one of the poor people whose life has been stuck in a box of poverty will have to spend 7 years trying to prove to a banker that they have the level of privilege to get banking. We have to make some deep moral choices at the moment. We stand at a crossroads because right now, the world governments are trying to abolish cash. They're trying to abolish the very last lifeline that remains for the billions of people who have a life of poverty, not because they don't work, they work harder than all of us. Not because they don't deserve, but simply because of where they were born, or what documentation they have, or what level of literacy they have, or even how they look. In Saudi Arabia, women are not allowed to own property and bank accounts. And this is the case in half a dozen countries around the world. And we look at that and say, shame on them, that's immoral, that's disgusting. And then we turn around and we do the same thing to immigrants in this country and my country. I'm half British, half American. I have to apologize to 194 countries around the world the moment I arrive. And I know in my heart that every time I pay taxes, I'm killing thousands of people by proxy. I still pay because I'm also helping people who are in welfare, people who need help. But most importantly, when we make these moral choices, we have to understand surveillance never stopped crime. Surveillance is the license given to the people who are on the top of that to control our lives. They will commit crimes. They will commit the worst of crimes, what I call mega crimes. And I know Britain doesn't use the metric system, so mega is the prefix we use for millions. A mega crime is one where, for example, you foreclose on 1 million homeowners and don't go to jail. That's a mega crime. We're doing surveillance and analytics to catch a petty drug dealer who's selling pot for Bitcoin. Who's doing surveillance and analytics on Lockheed Martin? Who's doing surveillance and analytics on the money laundering banks? Nobody. Do you know why? None of them ever go to jail. The regulators are completely captured, and the very system of controlling finance from above by having levers of power over the lives of millions of people, billions of people, of having the audacity to cut off entire countries and say, well, they're under sanctions. They're not privileged enough, they're not people enough to gain financial services. Guess who that attracts? If you build levers of power like that, the very worst sociopaths in our society are attracted like flies to shit to grab hold of those levers of power and destroy all of your freedoms as quickly as they can. We are building societies in which one bad election is the last election. And if you don't believe me, look at what's happened in Turkey, what's happened in Russia, what's happened in Venezuela, what happens every day to billions of people around the world. Let me end on a positive note, because you're probably a bit freaked out by all of this. You should be. This is serious stuff. Open, borderless, public, transparent, neutral, censorship-resistant, strictly private cryptocurrencies exist. They will not be regulated. They cannot be regulated, not by committees, because they're regulated by mathematics. They're regulated by algorithms. They provide certainty of transaction. They provide programmable customer protection. They provide reputation management. They provide access without identity. They give billions of people, eventually, not just a bank account in their pocket, but a bank in their pocket. They democratize the function of banking and turn it into an app that everyone can access without vetting, because they've already pre-vetted. They have agreed to download the software that follows the rules of consensus, and that is the only vetting required in these systems. But we shouldn't allow that. We did. But we can't have people make anonymous transactions. They will. But we must regulate this. You can't. And you won't. Because 6 billion people need this. And you have neither the moral authority, nor, more importantly, the practical capability to stand in their way, or even to stand in the way of what is going to be the greatest revolution in financial services in 3 centuries: universal access to basic finance. Thank you.
Mike asks, "Hi, Andreas. I store my crypto on a ledger. Listening to Trace Meyer this week has me concerned that this is not safe enough. Trace says you need Bitcoin Core for network validation, Armory for managing the private keys, and a Glacier protocol for standard operating procedures, and a Purism laptop for hardware. What is the gold standard for storing crypto for non-technical people? Is a hardware wallet good enough? And if my crypto has been on my hardware wallet for a year now, is it more or less likely to be hacked over time?" So here's the thing. The different audiences, different groups of people are going to have different risk models, and they're also going to have different tolerance for technical complexity. And the important thing to realize here is that technical complexity is part of the risk model, meaning that if what you're trying to do with security is more technically complex than your level of skill, you introduce a very serious risk that you will lose your crypto, not because it's stolen, but because your ambition for technical excellence exceeded your skill level for technical execution, and you frankly messed it up. And this applies to every level of technical expertise. And there is always a higher level of security you can achieve by adding a bit more complexity. Security is not an on-off thing. It's not, it is secure or it is not secure. There is no gold standard for security that applies for everyone. There is a sweet spot where the risks that you face from external factors, from the adversarial model that you have identified, where you understand who might be after your crypto and under what circumstances they might access it. The risk model you have for resilient long-term storage, and also you should be thinking about inheritance and how your loved ones will deal with this if something happens to you. The risk model you have for simple loss, which includes a fire, a flood, an environmental disaster, a problem with your home, or the other areas where you store keys, termites that eat through your paper backups, or whatever else the risk model might be. And then you balance that against your technical skill, and you find which of these risks you can eliminate in a way that both you and the people you will designate as helping your loved ones recover your crypto if something happens to you can execute that technical plan flawlessly. That's the sweet spot. So Trace's sweet spot is Bitcoin Core for network validation, Armory for managing private keys, Glacier Protocol for standard operating procedures, Purism laptop for hardware. Other people have a higher sweet spot. Maybe, for example, for Coinbase's cold storage, they use a Faraday cage. They have a room that is lined with an electromagnetic shield so it won't leak RF. And other people use nothing, right? So there's a range here. What Trace is doing is identifying his sweet spot based on his technical level of expertise and the people around him that he has able to assist him and others if the need comes. He's also balancing this against his lifestyle and where he lives and what access he has to secure locations to store his keys, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. None of this is going to be the same for you. You have to figure out what is right for you. For 99% of users, this is not right. And the reason it's not right is because 99% of users of crypto do not have the technical expertise to execute on a plan of this complexity. As a result, what they will do is they will overextend and underachieve on technical execution, and they stand a much bigger risk of losing crypto because of key loss than having crypto stolen because of an external adversary. Your own lack of technical expertise and your overambition in execution is going to cause you to lose your crypto, not some nefarious hacker. Having said that, what can you do that is practical? If you have your crypto on a hardware wallet, that is a fairly high level of security. The important question then comes, where is that hardware wallet backed up? Where are those backups stored? How are those backups stored? And do you have additional layers of security? For example, if you have a hardware wallet with a PIN, then the hardware device itself is somewhat secure, but it's still vulnerable to physical attacks, meaning you have to secure the physical location where you have that hardware wallet. A wall safe, floor safe, or even a hidden compartment where you can hide your hardware wallet is often enough security if people don't know that you have crypto. If people know that you have crypto and they know where you live, then you have a slightly higher degree of risk, and you need to account for that. Now about the backups. Writing 24 English words on a piece of paper with your own handwriting is probably the most resilient way you can back up your hardware wallet. You have to protect that seed. And most people are very worried that someone's going to break in, identify what the 24 words are, and steal their money. That's not the biggest risk. The biggest risk is you lose it, you forget where you put it, you didn't do the backup in the first place, it got moisture, that's going to be a real problem. Paper gets wet and it gets destroyed, the ink bleeds, whatever. Or you had a fire, termites, or some other natural disaster that destroyed your only backup. So you can protect against many of these risks. Step one, create another layer of protection. Make a passphrase on top of the seed so that you have this additional layer of security. You still need to back up your passphrase because if you pass or are involved in an accident and you're the only one who knows the passphrase, then that is a point of failure. Your crypto is lost. It would be very difficult to brute force. A simple 4 to 6 word random English word, passphrase is sufficient if you physically protect your seed from disclosure. I would also add important measures. Make 2 or more copies of your seed and store them in geographically distant locations. The seed on its own without the passphrase is not sufficient to break it. Take that paper seed and laminate it so that it is protected from moisture, which is the #1 risk. Then put it in a tamper-evident sealed envelope. You can buy these by the hundreds from retailers. They're often used for cash donations in religious institutions and things like that. This will allow you to ensure with easy inspection whether anyone has peeked at your seed and give you peace of mind that no one has accessed that particular copy of the seed. Create more than 2 copies of it. Put it in a standard fireproof safe that can resist a fire, and put 2 copies in 2 different locations which are unlikely to burn down at the same time. With these measures in place, you have protected yourselves from the biggest risks, which are accidental damage, environmental damage, and loss due to insufficient backups. You have to also back up those 4 to 6 word passphrases. Write those down on paper, laminate those, put them in a tamper-evident envelope, store 2 or more copies in 2 or more different locations from where their seeds are. And then finally, write a letter so that people know that these things exist, and coordinate with your family so they know that these things exist, but they can't easily access them and take away your crypto. For most people, the simple Stone Age technology of paper, pencil, with a little modern addition of a laminated sheet so you don't get moisture damage, and a simple, cheap plastic envelope that makes it obvious if someone has peeked at your seed, is sufficient. You do not need to go to the extremes and the technical complexity of Glacier protocol. And here's the problem. When people give advice like this, when they say that if you don't achieve this level that I feel confident at, you are not secure, what they're doing is not encouraging people to achieve better security. They're either pushing people to try to overextend their technical skill and making them at risk of losing their crypto due to a variety of technical problems, or they're pushing people to go to custodial exchanges. The vast majority of people, having read things like the Glacier protocol, will go, I don't even know. And they'll either try to do it without understanding it fully, be very uncomfortable with their knowledge, and probably lose their crypto because they messed it up, or they're just going to give up on the first page and move their crypto into custodial storage and let someone else take care of the security. We have an intermediate level that people can use. Hardware wallets with paper backups, properly secured with a passphrase, are very effective. They're easy to do for most people. And if you follow the instructions and don't try to improvise, don't try to do things like cutting up your seed into groups of words and sprinkling them in different locations. Don't try to use overly complex passphrases, or take the words, put them in a file, encrypt that file with PGP, store it on Drop, and none of that. Old-fashioned, low-tech, paper, pencil, protection from water, protection from fire, multiple redundant copies, second factor passphrase. That is achievable by most people. Mike, your crypto's fine on the hardware wallet. It won't get hacked. It's not more likely to be hacked now than it was any time in the past. 99% of the attacks you see against hardware wallets, you read about in academic papers or you see at academic security conferences, require physical access to the device. And even then, they don't work if you've updated your firmware correctly. And more importantly, the biggest risk you face, Mike, is losing your crypto because you didn't properly back up your hardware wallet, or because you tried to follow a set of instructions that started with, obtain the Unobtainium Linux distribution and install on an air-gapped Faraday cage protected supercomputer in an underground bunker, and you went hands up and put your money on Coinbase.
Current status of Bitcoin and other open blockchains. How can users who purchase their BTC on an exchange exposing all of their anonymity protect their privacy and anonymity? Especially when governments have very sophisticated tools such as chain analysis. Should there be infrastructure and a paradigm shift on how users switch their assets from fiat to crypto? It's a great question. Right now, Ermin, it's actually very difficult to protect your privacy because the fiat system has all of these rules that tie all transactions to identity. Basically, the fiat system is designed to be a surveillance machine. And so if your on-ramp, if you like, if your entrance into the crypto space is through the surveillance fiat system, then you start your journey under full surveillance. And as a result, your privacy is going to be severely compromised. Now, this isn't something that is necessarily the fault of exchanges. Exchanges are trying to work as a bridge between fiat and crypto, and fiat is a surveillance system. So they can't not do the surveillance that's required by governments around the world when touching the fiat system. So how do you maintain your privacy? How do you maintain anonymity? How do you protect your human rights, your ability to transact without everything you do being under the scrutiny, absent any suspicion or wrongdoing? How do you protect yourself? Well, one way is to think about how you get to the crypto economy in a different way. And I've talked about this before, but I think it's worth emphasizing again. And that is, if instead of buying crypto, you earn it by giving your labor, your services, effectively by selling products or services that you would sell otherwise, doing your job and earning your income in crypto, then it's not an exchange. It doesn't touch fiat, and as a result, it's not part of the surveillance and reporting system. Of course, you have to report your income, or you may choose not to, but you should report your income and all of the other requirements of the law. But you don't have to report which crypto address you received your income on. So you have a much higher degree of privacy when you do private transactions between individuals rather than dealing with a regulated exchange, for example. Another way is to think about various privacy services that exist that help you. Once you have crypto that you've acquired on an exchange, the address that you receive that crypto, for example, by withdrawing it from the exchange, is tainted. What does that mean? That means that the moment you did a withdrawal, the exchange will have associated your identity, which they've recorded, with the address you sent the crypto to. They will either assume that that's someone you're paying if they have information of that address belonging to a merchant through other systems that are under surveillance, or they'll assume that that address belongs to you. As part of the deal that these exchanges have with various analytics firms in order to support what they call Know Your Customer, KYC, and anti-money laundering regulations, AML, they will actually send information on every transaction to the analysis firms together with the identity that they have. And in return, they'll get some kind of score, a risk score that says whether they should allow or not that transaction. So this is a very dirty deal, if you like, whereby in order to receive score information about the risk of a transaction from a KYC AML perspective, the exchanges are effectively forced to send all identifying information about all incoming and outgoing transactions to the analytics firms, which means that the exchanges then become a giant surveillance machine. This also applies to all of the merchant processing centralized points that perhaps are building e-commerce shops and things like that, or converting crypto into fiat for merchants. Again, in order for them to be able to comply with the regulations and get a risk score or an AML score on any single transaction, they have to send all transactions with associated identity to the analytics firms. So the moment you do a withdrawal, your receiving address has been tainted and associated with you. And at that point, the only way to break that association is to do some transactions between your own wallets that will obfuscate the sources of those funds. Now, depending on your jurisdiction, that may be perfectly legal, or it might not be. And I'm not going to give you legal advice as to whether you should or shouldn't do that. Simply know that there are tools out there that will allow you, in places where that is legal, to add a layer of privacy to your transactions by, for example, mixing cryptocurrency transactions with your wallets and other wallets, which in some jurisdictions is perfectly legal and in some others is not. Will a Tether collapse lead to such a fierce bear market that it kills off Bitcoin? And will decentralized atomic swaps and BISC be too late and weak to save the day? You know, I haven't really studied what's happening with Tether, but I do know that it is a centralized and centrally managed system, and that represents custodial risks, counterparty risks, like any other centralized and centrally controlled system. Having lived through a few very, very big crises in Bitcoin, I'm really not fearful of a fierce bear market that could kill off Bitcoin. I really don't think that that can happen for a variety of reasons. One reason is that most people who get into Bitcoin today don't realize how big a deal the collapse of Mt. Gox was. We're talking about a time when there was only one exchange, when that exchange was responsible for price setting, and when that exchange was responsible for the vast majority of all of the exchange volume. And when it collapsed suddenly, catastrophically, and with a loss that was a staggering amount of money as a percentage of the total amount of Bitcoin in circulation. And Bitcoin didn't die. It was the first and only time I was afraid that this might really knock Bitcoin back by a long time, or even potentially stop it in its tracks and force us to reboot the currency and start something new. And when it didn't happen, I realized that Bitcoin is more resilient than I thought. And then I started thinking about what my reaction would have been if Bitcoin had dropped precipitously back to double digits or even single digits in value against the dollar. And I realized that what I would probably do is buy all of them with whatever cash I had. And then I realized that everybody else would be thinking the same, or at least a very large number of people who had seen that this experiment was working and believed in it would think the same. This idea of buy the dip isn't always investment advice or good investment advice. In fact, in some cases, it's terrible investment advice. It's catching a falling knife, as they say in investment circles. But there are some people who believe in this project so strongly that if they see an opportunity to get back in at a much lower cost basis, they will. And some of these people have a lot of money now. And so they will, what they consider a buying opportunity is much higher than what I would. In fact, I recently saw a tweet that was kind of funny, which said, what would you do if Bitcoin dropped to zero? And someone responded, it wouldn't, because if it dropped to 1 penny, I could buy all of them for $168,000, and I would. That kind of attitude at different price points means that I don't see that scenario. Could a collapse of something like Tether set us back by a significant period of time? Yes. I mean, we keep seeing these things happen, and they're the result of centrally controlled, centrally managed custodial systems, and Tether is one of those. The same thing could be said for the recent massive theft at CoinCheck, which was $500 million worth of NEM and a significant amount of Ripple. We will continue to see these centralized systems introduce counterparty risk, and every now and then that counterparty risk is going to turn into an actualized loss. Question comes from Harry the Horse. Are decentralized, that's a funny name, by the way. Are decentralized online exchanges possible with a fiat gateway? Harry asks. Let me see if there's a bit more to that question. I just have to open it up. With more adoption, many startup projects are being created to address the issue of centralized exchanges by introducing various decentralized exchanges from crypto to crypto pairings, where the exchange trader or customer owns the keys to the exchange wallet. Is it going to be possible to have a decentralized online exchange with a fiat gateway, meaning where you can exchange cryptocurrency for national currency, or is this something that could never happen? Also, what are your thoughts about the future of decentralized online exchanges over the next 1-2 years? I think decentralized exchanges are going to become a very big part of this industry in 2 or 3 ways that might be surprising. So let me start with the last question first. The future of decentralized online exchanges, I think, is huge, primarily because we're beginning to see the ability to launch a couple of technologies that are really going to revolutionize things. One of those is atomic swaps. We already have demonstrated applications that can do atomic swaps between different blockchains. An atomic swap is where 2 parties each pledge on one side of a cryptocurrency in a way that they don't need a third party or escrow system. They escrow each other. And then the code that is needed to release one side guarantees that the other side can release their funds. And if neither side releases the funds, then they both can get a refund after a time. It's a basic smart contract using multi-sig and time locks. It's very, very similar to the type of smart contract you see in payment channels. And atomic swaps make it possible for 2 individuals independently to swap 2 cryptocurrencies and swap them atomically, meaning that it's all or nothing. Either both transactions go through or neither transaction goes through, and neither party can walk away and steal the currency. So that's they don't have to trust each other. They don't have to trust in any third party. So that's a big development. The other big development is the fact that Lightning Network can be used to do atomic swaps between currencies. Effectively, you can create a channel where you send a payment in, say, Bitcoin, and the other party receives it in Litecoin. So you can use Lightning Network as an overlay network to exchange crypto to crypto. I think these 2 developments are going to be very exciting. So now back to your first question, which is, can you have a decentralized exchange with a fiat gateway? Yes, you can. In fact, it already exists. One example is BISC, which is spelled B-I-S-Q. And BISC is a decentralized exchange that runs a peer-to-peer protocol. In fact, it runs over Tor, and it allows parties to escrow and then exchange cryptos for cryptos, as well as cryptos for national currencies. Here's the problem, though. There is a certain degree of risk whenever you exchange cryptocurrency for a national currency. And the reason for that is that the cryptocurrency side is non-reversible. Even if you escrow it for a while, at some point when you make that payment, once you've made that payment, it cannot be reversed. On the other hand, there is no way to fully guarantee and clear with absolute finality the exchange of fiat unless you do it with cash. So if you did a fiat to cryptocurrency exchange where someone mailed cash through the postal service, which is probably illegal in many countries and I wouldn't recommend it, you could have finality on the fiat side, but then that would expose the fiat holding person to extreme risk, because why pay the cryptocurrency? You'd need an escrow on both ends. The biggest problem is that if you, for example, set it up so that someone makes a cash deposit into your bank account, great, then you send them the crypto, then they reverse the cash deposit. You'd be surprised at how easy it is to walk into a bank and say, that was a fraud, I got defrauded, here's my deposit slip, I deposited cash into this bank account, and can you please reverse it? And they will reverse it. They'll give you back cash or move it back into another account. So if you're the person who just sent crypto, you're out of luck. Like, good luck arguing with your bank. In fact, the moment you walk in and say, hey, I gave this person cryptocurrency in return for that cash, they're probably going to say, oh, well, cryptocurrency, I heard that's illegal, so we're not going to help you. It's also possible to reverse PayPal transfers, possible to reverse wire transfers, possible to reverse credit card transactions. And in fact, there is no limit as to how far back in time you can go. Theoretically, a bank can simply pull the money out of your account. If you've already spent it from the account, they will simply deduct the money, you'll have a negative balance, and the next time you put money in there, they're going to take from that. So even if that money isn't in there, they'll just take from other money like your wages. Or they'll simply put you in credit and then send you letters and eventually send debt collectors after you to collect. There is no time at which you can say with absolute finality that a bank deposit, bank transfer, wire transfer, credit card transfer, or PayPal transfer is final. No 6 confirmations. Infinity confirmations are not enough for fiat. It is a soft promise, and it can never be a hard promise. And that's why fiat gateways are always risky. What do people who are using BISC do? They take a risk. And as long as it's a small amount, that might be an acceptable risk, but that doesn't scale.
Jen asks, how do you envision markets transitioning from centralized to decentralized exchanges, and what are the implications you see at large? Decentralized exchanges are a fantastic idea. I think it's an idea that can be applied fairly directly to trading between open digital cryptocurrencies. But trading cryptocurrencies to fiat currencies, trading between, for example, US dollars and Bitcoin, is a lot harder to decentralize. And the reason for that is because the dollar system is centralized. You have some examples of decentralization, and recently they haven't been growing as fast, and things like local Bitcoins or various types of cash markets, ATM machines. Those are fiat to Bitcoin exchanges, and they are decentralized, but they can't really generate a lot of volume of transactions. They're not very convenient. Whereas doing things like atomic swaps, cross-chain atomic swaps, where you can swap currencies from 2 blockchains with 2 transactions that are trustless and where neither participant can cheat, means that we could see many more decentralized cryptocurrency to cryptocurrency exchanges. So we'll see how that happens. I think that will be really interesting. Another possibility that we're seeing, and I think a lot of different participants are now exploring, is the possibility of having fiat currencies expressed as some kind of pegged cryptocurrency. An example of that would be Tether, or there are some proposals for some other forms like that, where basically you have fiat currency in reserve, and then you have a cryptocurrency asset that's issued in equal proportion, and you can trade that on the blockchain. That allows you to do arbitrage and decentralized exchanges for fiat currencies too. Although, of course, the bank deposits that contain the actual asset, for example, US dollar, those are still central.
Energy consumption in mining.
Yes.
And what's the solution for that?
Well, the energy consumption in mining, I think, is misrepresented very often in two ways. One is that mining itself is one of the few industries that is completely geographically independent, meaning that it doesn't matter where you are if you are mining, as long as you have inexpensive electricity. So what that allows you to do is choose the location of your mining system based entirely on the local cost of electricity, which means that mining is doing arbitrage, market arbitrage for the cheapest sources of electricity. Now, in many cases, the reason a source of electricity is cheap is because it does not match the demand at that location. In countries where there aren't broadly deployed efficient distribution networks for electricity, one of the challenges with rapidly deploying and developing energy is that you build a power plant not for the demand that it has today, but you build it for the demand that you're going to have over the next 15 years. Because you have to make that investment now and grow into it, because you can't simply move energy across a massive country when you don't have a distribution network. I'm speaking of China, if you didn't figure it out, but that's one of the fundamental problems they have. And this problem is replicated across not just China, but many developing nations, as well as many developed nations. The places where electricity is needed and the times when electricity is needed are almost always not the places and times where electricity is available. So what happens when you build a 50 megawatt plant in a place where they only have 15 megawatts of demand? Well, in some cases, if it's alternative energy like wind, solar, or hydro, you can't turn it off or turn it down. So you've built it and it will produce, and then what? Then you're basically wasting energy. Now, what if in that environment you could find a way to turn that energy into an alternative store of value? And then instead of paying off for the electricity plant in 5 years, you pay it off in 1 year by using electricity that would be otherwise wasted. Now, Bitcoin is an environmental subsidy to alternative energy all around the world because it's causing these projects to be amortized over a year instead of 5. Oh, you're telling me we were running a green coin all this time and I didn't even notice? So one problem is that you've got to understand it from the perspective of balancing supply and demand on a global scale without distribution networks. And that's driving the decentralization of Bitcoin, is driving the decentralization of energy production, which is one of the most important trends in human history. Now, one of the other things you've got to keep in mind is that Bitcoin is easy to criticize for its energy consumption because it's obvious. There are a lot more much wasteful things that are far less obvious. You know, for every time you pull out that little plastic card and you use it to do a transaction, you're not aware of the 100,000 square foot data center that is churning 100,000 servers to do fraud detection or clearing or whatever. You're not aware of the tower offices that are lit 24 hours a day, and the trading floors and the bank vaults and the armored cars and the diesel trucks and the blah, 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 blah. All of those costs are mostly hidden, and they're enormous. Are you telling me that perhaps Bitcoin ends up being the most efficient way to do transactions on a global scale? You got to remember that the level of security we have for Bitcoin today is a level of security that can handle global attacks by colluding nation states. That's the level of security that is needed for this system to remain censorship resistant. But if the system was 10 times bigger with 10 times more users, it doesn't need 10 times more mining. It already has globally secure mining. What we have is enough. There's a profit motive that drives it, but it's a mistake to think that simply if we go global, that cost will also multiply. Quite the opposite, in fact. Over time, the reward from mining decreases, and as a result, it's more likely we'll see that gradually taper off and plateau. So this is a long game. The implications and complexity of how cost is allocated and how energy is consumed is huge. I don't think we can afford 2 proof-of-work systems on this planet, but I think we might only need 1. Maybe everything else could be proof of stake and anchor into the only proof of work system we have. We need 1 planetary scale proof of work system to offer us true energy dependent immutability. But maybe we can only afford 1. Turns out that might be Bitcoin's killer app.
Can the cost of energy be minimized by green energy? What about the economy of the whole world mining in such a case? Yes, in fact, green energy plays a very important role in mining because one of the characteristics of mining is that it can occur anywhere, especially now that we have the ability to receive blocks by satellite. You can pretty much do mining anywhere in the world where you have energy. And that energy can come from any source. It can come from wind, it can come from solar, it can come from hydroelectric, it can come from dirty coal, it can come from nuclear energy. It can come from any of these sources. But energy has different properties, and the generation, or actually energy doesn't, energy is fungible, but energy production facilities have different properties. For example, solar produces the most amount of energy during the midday noon sun, and the least amount of energy at night, which is 0. And often the amount of energy that is produced does not match the amount of energy that is consumed at those times. So in fact, the most energy that is consumed in a city is usually around 8 or 9 p.m. in the evening, whereas the production of solar energy is not peaking at that time, it's near 0. How do you reconcile these two mismatches? Essentially, you have energy that is being produced for free once you have the capacity in place. The capital cost is in place. There is no operating cost for a solar energy system other than small maintenance cost. And therefore, if you're producing it in the middle of the day and nobody needs that energy is wasted. So mining can actually take that wasted energy and use it to produce income. And what that income does is it allows you to very rapidly depreciate the capital expense of building the solar plant in the first place, which means that you can take a solar plant that otherwise would be depreciated over a period of, say, 5 years or 10 years, and you can depreciate it over a period of 1 or 2 years, which leads to an enormous investment in solar, because if you can depreciate the cost of the underlying capital, that makes the deployment of solar much cheaper. And of course, for the miners who are mining on this energy, the cost of that energy can be much lower. So the profitability can be much higher.
Because mining can happen anywhere, mining will happen in the places where electricity is cheapest, where the difference between capacity and demand is the greatest, where the ability to distribute the electricity by other means, such as high voltage distribution networks, exists less or doesn't exist at all. And all of those represent opportunities. In fact, that means that the greatest opportunities for mining are from sources of alternative energy, such as wind, solar, and hydroelectric, geothermal even, because those are the sources that are remote, often from populated areas, that are difficult to distribute because of the cost of distribution networks, and where there is a large mismatch between capacity and demand, which means that Bitcoin is currently underwriting massive investments in alternative energy around the world. John asks, while I understand that the computing power used to generate the proof of work derives value from the very fact that it secures the Bitcoin blockchain, I was wondering if there are any workable solutions for diverting that computer power for bonus value creation, tackling problems requiring big computing powers. Are applications like protein folding or finding sets of primes workable, or anything else workable in this space? John, yes. In fact, there have been a number of systems that attempted to exploit the mining algorithm, the consensus algorithm, to do things that people consider useful, such as protein folding or finding primes, etc. However, Bitcoin doesn't do that. Bitcoin uses an algorithm whose only use is for Bitcoin, really, and has no other practical use other than proving to the rest of the world that the miners have committed a certain amount of energy and therefore expenditure to back the security of the network. It's essentially the promise each miner makes. Here is a block. I have validated all of the transactions according to the consensus rules. I swear this under penalty of losing the energy that I have put in, and here is the proof of work demonstrating my commitment to securing and validating these transactions and obeying the consensus rules. That promise is in the form of energy consumed for the proof of work algorithm. Part of the problem with doing something else, something that other people might consider useful, is that splits the reward. It means that the miners have two reasons for which they're mining. One is to secure the network, and the other is to produce protein folding signatures or large primes. So what happens if the production of primes becomes more valuable than the Bitcoin security? What happens if there's a disruption in that network? Let's say, for example, suddenly we find a new application for specific types of protein folding or specific types of prime numbers that make it extremely valuable to produce these numbers or these proteins. Well, the problem with that, of course, is at that point, it's no longer worthwhile doing the security on the Bitcoin blockchain. It's only worthwhile using that equipment to doing the protein folding. Or rather, it's more worthwhile to do the secondary function than it is to do the primary function. And then Bitcoin security ceases being the primary function, at which point you can no longer trust the promise. And the promise being, I committed this energy to prove that I did the security of validating the transactions. If you can't trust that promise, then Bitcoin securities fail. The whole idea of only doing this to secure Bitcoin is that you can trust that promise. It has no other incentive. There is no other reason you would be doing this calculation other than proving your commitment to doing the security of validating the transactions correctly. And so Bitcoin's mining is useful. It's useful in proving the security of the Bitcoin network. And the more energy that is committed to proving that security, the more secure the network is, and the harder it is to attack or compromise the security of the Bitcoin network. Bitcoin's proof of work algorithm produces useful work. It produces the security that backs a global currency worth almost $15 billion. And it produces the security that ensures that that global currency cannot be attacked by any actor, however large they may be, without colluding and investing a lot of money in hardware and energy. And that becomes very difficult the more energy and the more hardware that backs Bitcoin's security. That is the useful application of Bitcoin's mining. And we only have one because we want that to always be the dominant use of Bitcoin's mining and never become second place to something else. Can you explain the life cycle of a transaction from the point someone sends a transaction from their wallet until the point it is confirmed on the Bitcoin blockchain? That's a great question, Mario. Let's get right into it. Your wallet constructs a transaction by accumulating the Bitcoin you have in your wallet and assigning it a destination address or multiple destination addresses, and then signing that transaction. At that point, your wallet transmits that to one of any of the nodes it is connected to. In fact, it will start, but then it will transmit to all of the nodes it is connected to. A wallet might be connected to 1, 2, 3, 4, perhaps 8 different nodes. It will transmit the signed transaction. These other network nodes, which may be other wallets, they may be mining nodes, they may be nodes belonging to exchanges or merchants or people doing e-commerce or people just running a node for fun. They will each receive this transaction from your node. The first thing they will do is validate it. Every node validates every transaction. When they receive this transaction from your node, they don't know if your node created this transaction or if it was just forwarding it, because they're receiving transactions from all of the nodes around them all the time. That's how transactions are propagated. So they receive this transaction, they validate it. If it is valid, all of the amounts are correct, it has the necessary fee, it is not trying to spend something that's already been spent, et cetera, all of the rules of consensus. The signatures are all valid. It fulfills certain criteria as to the size of the transaction, the size of the scripts within the transaction, et cetera, et cetera. Everything is validated by each of the nodes that receive your transaction. Only then do the nodes that received your transaction then send it to all of the nodes they're connected to. So you send it to all of the nodes you're connected to. They each validate it, then they send it out to all of the nodes they're connected to, which send it out to all of the nodes they're connected to, always after validating, until eventually, through this process of flood propagation, as it's called, the transaction will be sent to every node in the network. Some of those nodes will be miners. Now, let's talk about what happens when the transaction is validated on each node it's received, whether that's a mining node or not. All of the nodes, including your own, maintain a pool of unconfirmed transaction. Think of this as a giant bucket where all unconfirmed transactions go to wait to be confirmed. All nodes keep track of what transactions they've seen that have not yet been confirmed, and they store them in this pool of transactions, which is called the mempool. Of course, important to understand, there isn't one mempool, there isn't the mempool. There is a mempool on every node. And because of differences in timing and differences in propagation, any one mempool on any one node is not going to have an identical set transactions as every other mempool, although they will probably have 99% overlap. The same transactions, perhaps received in a different order, will probably be in most of the mempools in most of the nodes. On mining nodes, the mempool serves a very important purpose. It serves the purpose of providing transactions for the miner to add to a new block. So If you're looking now at this from the perspective of one of these mining nodes, they have just found out that a new block has been found, which means the race is on for the next block. So in order to participate in that competition as a miner, they have to construct a block that they will try to solve the proof of work on. And they do that first by constructing an empty block. That empty block has a link to the previous block, the one they know about most recently, to establish its position on the chain. It has a timestamp, it has some other information in the header, and it has at least one transaction, which is the Coinbase transaction that pays them. When they construct their own empty block, the miners put their own address as the destination payment in that block. Now, this block is not valid. It doesn't have proof of work. It also doesn't have any transactions. At this point, they will send that block to all of their mining equipment to start trying to find a proof of work, but they'll now also try to add transactions. So they reach into the pool of unconfirmed transactions and they start looking for the transactions that pay the most fee. They're looking for transactions that pay the most Satoshis per byte, so they can maximize the amount of profit they can make by filling this block. So they start pulling transactions out based on which one has the maximum fee. They've already validated all of these transactions. That's why they're in the mempool. They don't get into their mempool unless they've been validated. And they start putting them into this new block. We call that a candidate block because it hasn't yet been proven. As they add transactions, the block gets bigger. And every time they add something, they send it back to the mining equipment so the mining equipment can try to find a proof on the block. If they're lucky, at some point after doing billions of hashes, their mining equipment finds a nonce that creates a block hash that is below the target difficulty, which is therefore a valid proof of work, and immediately tell the node of the miner, we found a block. And the mining node then propagates that block out to every node that it's connected to. In the same way that the transactions reach the mining node, the block leaves the mining node and is propagated back out to all of the other nodes on the network. So both transactions and blocks are propagated through this flooding process. When other miners receive this block, they validate it as quickly as they can, and then they immediately stop trying to find a block and start again with this new block as the parent, because they know they lost the previous round of competition. Somebody else won. Therefore, they need to start again. All the nodes back to your wallet receive this block. As they receive the block, they validate it, just like they validate every transaction. As they're validating it and they're looking at the transactions that are in there, they go, this transaction was in my mempool, but it's now I see in a block. So I'm going to take it out of the mempool and consider it confirmed. So they take transactions out of their mempool once they know that that transaction is confirmed. And this block will propagate all the way back until it reaches your wallet, at which point your wallet will know that its transaction has one confirmation. And then the process continues. So that's the entire life cycle of a transaction.
One little subtle detail there, you may have noticed that as soon as I had a valid block with just a Coinbase transaction, I didn't wait to start putting transactions in it. I sent that empty block with just a Coinbase to my mining hardware and had it mine while I was picking transactions from the mempool. While the node was picking and validating transactions from the mempool, it was already mining an empty block. And there's a reason for that, because it might take me 4, 5, 6 seconds to validate the transactions that I want to put into the block and to validate that the previous block and all of its transactions were correct. During that time, there's no reason to have my mining hardware sitting there doing nothing. Those 4 or 5 seconds could be enough time for it to accidentally find a nonce that's valid and do proof of work. So we want to have the mining hardware working all the time, which is why you sometimes see empty blocks on Bitcoin. They pop up every now and then. You'll see a block that just has a Coinbase transaction. Usually it comes right after, very shortly after, a block was found. So you'll see 2 in a row and the second one will be empty. That's exactly why that happens. It's because the hashing power was not sitting idle. It was mining while the node was trying to find and validate transactions to put into the candidate block. And that's fine. In fact, it's great. That extra hashing power adds security to the Bitcoin network. It increases the amount of difficulty, the cumulative difficulty of the chain. It's a net positive, and it doesn't take away from the capacity of the network because another block might be found in the next few seconds. So there's no problem with that. It's a normal part of the network. Some say that a few miners control 70% of the hash power. Is this centralization? Yes, it is centralization on one axis of the system. It's not really clear that a few miners control 70% of the hash power. I think that's probably an overestimation. But it is possible that a few miners control more than 50% of the hash power. And this is a problem. It is a form of centralization. I think it's a temporary phenomenon, and I think it has to do a lot with the very, very rapid performance increases from 40 nanometer ASICs, or even from CPU to GPU to FPGA to 40 nanometer ASICs and all the way down to 12 nanometer ASICs that we saw over the past 9 years. That very rapid increase in performance made it so that miners who controlled the ability to fabricate silicon chips gained an enormous advantage. But that enormous increase in performance is over. You cannot keep going down from 12 nanometer because that is now the cutting edge technology that is available in fabrication, which means the level playing field has arrived. And that means it's likely we're going to see less centralization in miners over time because other forces, such as operational risks, geographic concentration risk, political risk, electricity availability risk, natural disaster risk, and all of these other risks work against centralization. If you have a warehouse with 100,000 miners pulling 10 megawatts of electricity in one region, you have a lot of economy of scale advantages, but one lightning strike, one political move, one additional tax, one fire in your warehouse, one flood, one electrical interruption, and you lose all of those miners in one go. So there are disadvantages of having everything concentrated in one place. The question is, do the forces of decentralization and the forces of centralization balance out? That's a very difficult question to answer. And just because Bitcoin is centralized in one area doesn't mean it's not decentralized in other areas. So centralization and decentralization are not a yes-no question. You can't say, is this centralized or not? More, you have to think of it as a multi-dimensional scale. Things can be somewhat centralized on some aspects of the system. The question is this system more decentralized on more aspects of the system than any other comparable system? And I would say Bitcoin is the most decentralized at-scale payment system that exists in the world in several different aspects. And I think it's likely to get more decentralized over time. We'll see how that goes.